Stein. I'm the founder and the chief instructor for the Science Technology Policy Academy, which I just started this summer when my live workshops all of a sudden became virtual. Many of the people here, I'm happy to say, are part of the classes that I've set up. And I thought I heard Bill give a talk on this issue at another event. And I thought, well, this is really a great perspective for us to have. So he agreed to speak at our very first webinar. So thanks everybody for coming and therefore making it a success just by your interest. So I've asked Bill to talk about both this topic as well as also to talk about career related issues as well. So keep those topics in mind also. So I met Bill when I was just a baby policy analyst many, many years ago when I was at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And he has been I view a mentor to me during a good portion of my career. And even though we both left the academy some time ago, I guess 10 years or so,
Mm-hmm.
yes, the years go by. Um, we've still been able to keep in touch, particularly at AAAS annual meetings. And every time I'm always hope that I will sort of see him in one of the hallways. After he left the academy, he became, as you see, the fourth advisor to the Secretary of State, which was the concept of having a science advisor for the Secretary of State came actually out of a National Academies report, which I imagine he might talk about. And then he went on to AAAS, where he heads up the science and diplomacy efforts there. Even before that, when I first met him, before he became basically the chief staff person for the academy, the executive officer, he was heading up the Policy and Global Affairs Division. Um, it wasn't called the Policy and Global Affairs Division at that time, but something like I think it was the Global Affairs Division um, at that time. So this has been something that he has worked in literally for decades, and he's really made a big impact in this field. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill. As a reminder, everybody should keep themselves on mute, ideally with video on, and put questions that are in chat, and we'll get to those. Well, I'll take those in order at the very end. Okay, Bill, go ahead.
No, thank you, Debbie. As you indicated, we worked together for a long time. But part of my job at the National Academies was protecting Debbie from the report review committee, and I can explain that to you if you're interested. And when Debbie asked me to talk, she also mentioned that some of you are early career, either postdocs, advanced graduate students, so I thought I would begin, at least talk for about 10 minutes just about what I've done over my career. It's kind of a random walk. It's not so much to tell you about me, but I think some of the lessons that I think I've learned, the importance of trying to find good mentors where you are in whatever career you're chosen, for deciding to focus on things that you're truly passionate about, be willing to take some risk when new opportunities emerge that may require changes in the path that you were following before. Well, I went to school a long time ago. I was an undergraduate and graduate student at Caltech. I went there in 1962, didn't leave until 1971, so it seemed like a lifetime ago. It was a wonderful place for science. I had Linus Pauling for chemistry. I was the teaching assistant for Richard Feynman. So great science, but it turns out Caltech was also, they thought it was really important for the little nerds that went there to make sure they had very good humanities and social science. And so I took courses in anthropology, history, economics. And it turns out, and what my career turned out to be, that some of those courses were as important as the science that I had. And some of the distinguished scientists I had when I was a graduate student in particular, when they were young, they'd been involved in the Manhattan Project during World War II. And they spent a lot of time for the rest of their career trying to make sure that nuclear weapons were never used again. And so they were an important influence. After Caltech, and this was when I was leaving in the early 1970s. By the way, in 1968, right now, the year 2020 feels an awful lot by 1968 for those of us that lived back then. But when I went off in 1971, I was a postdoc at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center and the Institute for Advanced Study. But that was also at the time of the first Earth Day, the Vietnam War. We had all the issues, the Cold War with the Soviet Union, the worry about, a nuclear conflict, all those things. Actually, plus we also had the the Watergate, and so the politics and all of these other issues were in the minds of sort of young scientists as they were trying to do their work in science. So as I went along these other places at Stanford, two distinguished scientists who spent a lot of their time working on arms control issues, a man named Sid Drill and Pete Panofsky. In fact, Pete was very much involved in dialogues with the Soviets and with Chinese scientists on these issues. And when I went to Princeton, the Institute for Advanced Study, actually Ben, sort of a young scientist, and Frank von Hippel, he had actually moved over to the Woodrow Wilson School, became a professor there, and he was also working on all of these societal issues. So I spent part of my time when I was there working with Frank and his colleagues. And so because of that, I thought, well, I got an assistant professorship, but I talked to Middle to give me the first year off before I even went there so I could apply for a AAAS fellowship working in Washington. Then it was, I think I was in the third or fourth class, and then it was a very small one. I think there were 8 of us, and it was only with the US Congress. It did not involve all the federal agencies. And it was also just a 1-year fellowship. Now it's a 2-year fellowship. But it's for those of you who don't know about it, it's a wonderful program. Now I think they have 300 plus a year, and with AAAS fellows serving in all parts of the US government, as well as in the Congress, and also for 2 years. And many of those have decided to switch their careers basically out of whatever they're doing in terms of science, engineering, and health, and focus on that interface between science and policy, either with the government or working in non-governmental and other organizations in Washington. But that was an interesting time. I worked for a congressman he was not a scientist, but he majored in industrial physics, and he loved science. He was a liberal Democrat, but he was also very interested in how science could be used as a way to connect different countries, particularly with the US and Mexico. He represented Riverside, California, but also the US and the Soviet Union at that time. Well, after that, I went back to being an assistant professor, and then all of a sudden I got a call that came out of the blue that a very distinguished biochemist at Harvard named Paul Doty, who had been on President Kennedy's Science Advisory Committee, and he was a good friend of the president of the Ford Foundation. He had gotten a large grant to create a new research center at Harvard called the Center for Science and International Affairs. He was also involved with the Aspen Institute in the summer, and he headed a program called Science, Technology, and Humanism. And he asked me if I would be as a deputy for the Aspen program, but also then to be a research fellow in the Kennedy School in this new center that was created. Now it's called the Belfer Center at Harvard. It's a very active, very large program dealing with all kinds of issues related to science and international affairs and foreign policy. But that was also a wonderful place to be. Lots of interaction with people at Harvard and MIT and others who were focused in this other world, all places which I had learned a lot. But anyway, both that opportunity came to me out of the blue, and it was, I think that's, to me anyway, they indicated if you have good mentors and that sometimes they can help you in ways that are totally unexpected. Well, after 5 years there, this was in the Reagan administration, and so I decided I needed a real job, a permanent job. So I became a professor at the University of Tennessee, a professor of physics. But my real job was still at this interface of science now and public policy. I headed several research centers dealing with energy and environmental issues, water issues, which was also very interesting, working with people at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, Tennessee Valley Authority, and others. And then in 1991, I got another call out of the blue, asked if I'd be interested in going to the National Academy of Sciences, National Research Council, to head what was then was called the Office of International Affairs. So it was the international part of the Academy of the National Research Council. So I thought, well, that really sounds interesting. So I took a sabbatical and went there. And again, it was a place that the person who previously headed it had gone off to the MacArthur Foundation to head large programs, but had created a wonderful group of standing committees and boards that were involved in every kind of issue you can imagine dealing with science and international affairs, from relations with China, with Japan, with arms control, with development of third world countries, human rights, international organizations. So I ended up staying. I stayed there for 2 years, still on a sabbatical, and then a new president came in, Bruce Alvarez, who Debbie and I both worked for, and he asked me to move over and be the executive officer. So I ended up spending 20 years at the National Academies, where the role was really helping to oversee all the expert studies that are done, to advise the nation through expert committees that are appointed. And the academies also are, now there are 3, of course, science, engineering, and medicine. But they work together to put together these committees, and it's a non-governmental institution that provides its advice by contract, individual contracts and grants, and the advice that it gives to the government and to the public, it's made public. It's not kept private. So part of my job was also being yelled at by politicians and people in government who necessarily didn't like some of the things that we were recommending, but because the public held the academies reviewed as being objective, non-political, and expert. A number of the studies, not all of them, but a number of them did turn out to have a significant influence. And so I learned a lot about the whole issue of science advice for policy during that experience. But I was always interested in the international thing, so I stayed very much involved. And in terms of science diplomacy, just among a couple of the things that are kind of relevant for that you might be interested in. The beginning about the year 2000, the U.S., with encouragement of the U.S. government, the academies was asked to also develop relationships with the Iranian academies of science. And in part, and the Iranian government did the same thing with its scientific community. The relations were then bad between the two governments. Probably they're even worse now. But at that time, both governments wanted to have a channel of communication between the two countries. And we didn't work on the nuclear issue, but we worked on all kinds of other things, medical issues, earthquake protection, wildlife protection, urban issues. So again, that was I learned a lot from that experience. And a lot of work done with the Chinese Academy of Sciences, the same sort of thing, dealing with issues that were common between the two, dealing there with air pollution and many other topics, as well as large programs dealing with developing parts of the world, in part some of them dealing with capacity building in science and technology. Well, anyway, after that experience at academies, and I decided to retire in 2011, Debbie mentioned there was a report done earlier by the Academy. In fact, there were 2 reports, both done in the same year, 1999, that turned out to have certainly an impact on my career after the Academies. The first one was called The Pervasive Role of Science and Technology in Foreign Affairs. And it was not funded by the government, but it was funded by a private individual. And it was to look at the issues associated with the role of science and technologies, scientific expertise and information in foreign policy and development, feeling the State Department had become more capable because almost every issue they dealt with had some component where science and technology was really important. So it was a superb report. It made lots of recommendations. Not all of them were adopted, but one of them was to create the position of Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State. And Madeleine Albright, who was the secretary then, she agreed to listen to the report, and she implemented that recommendation and created the position as a non-political fixed term of up to 3 years in the year 2000. The second report in 1999 that had and I'll mention why the first one had an impact on me, but the second one was called Our Common Journey, the Role of Science Technology for Sustainability. It was also funded by a private individual. It was not funded by the government. It was to look again at the role of science and technology for trying to achieve a more sustainable world. And In fact, an interesting aspect of that was the donor who provided it was a man named George Mitchell, who was an oil and gas man from Texas. And he had been a poor Greek immigrant coming to the United States and had made his fortune in wildcatting, but he's also known as the father of fracking, which of course is still in the news today. But anyway, he was not a deep thinker, but he felt that sustainability was really important. So he provided an endowment to the national academies to study those issues. And that was the first report that came out. And the title, Our Common Journey, why it used the word journey, I guess the main message was that for the science and technology community around the world to help the world achieve whatever its goals are related to economic, social, environmental issues, it was really a learning journey. It had to be interaction between the science community and the policy community and the public. And by learning by doing, the science community provided insights and advice of what was working and what was not working as countries and societies tried to achieve their goals. And I think that was a very important metaphor. Well, anyway, when I left the academy, the first report that I mentioned, although when I was leaving in 2011, the State Department was asking for advice because the former person had completed her term about new people who could take that non-political fixed term position. And so we're giving them advice. And all of a sudden they asked me if I was interested. And I said, well, that sounds like fun again. So I went from 2011 to 2014. It was during the terms of Secretaries Clinton and Kerry in the State Department. While I was there, I got involved with the United Nations. At the UN, at that time, they were negotiating what became the UN 2030 agenda. And that was development of what they call sustainable development goals that would stretch that 15 years, that would cover the waterfront and social, economic, and environmental issues that would apply to all countries. And approved unanimously. But the diplomats also had, I think, the light bulb went on that if they were going to make progress on these very broad goals, they had to do a better job harnessing science and technology. They didn't know quite how to do that. And so they created what they called a new initiative called the Technology Facilitation Mechanism, facilitate what they were trying to accomplish. And for 2 years, 2016 to 2018, I co-chaired an external advisory committee appointed by the UN Secretary General advising on this initiative, and I'm still involved with them. Okay, so anyway, in my career, I think the one thing I learned is if you follow what you're really passionate about, if you develop good mentors who can think of you when they recognize opportunities you may not be aware of, you're willing to take some risks and launch off into new directions that you are very interested in. Often things work out okay. But what about science diplomacy? Of course, science and international affairs has been a topic ever since World War II. And talking about science and diplomacy became popular, certainly in the last 30 years ago. So why was the "and" dropped and it became just science diplomacy? My good friend Vaughn Tarikian was at the AAAS at that time, and in 2012 he created the Center for Science Diplomacy and also the little online journal, which I'm now editor-in-chief of. And the term science diplomacy came in vogue. There was a meeting that was between the AAAS and the Royal Society that kind of publicized it. But to me, the significance of it is that science diplomacy indicates action. It is really an instrument, a mechanism for achieving something. It's using scientific engagement, science and technology collaboration, scientific knowledge, scientific expertise to accomplish concrete goals. They can be diplomatic goals, they can be other goals, they can be national goals, they can be global goals, they can also go the other way around. Diplomacy to help advance the scientific enterprise. But to me, what interests me in science diplomacy, it's actually a tool for accomplishing something. And it's accomplished by having this partnership between science and policy and society. And there have been many examples, in my view, they were great successes of science diplomacy. Often people point to the Montreal Protocol. But in order to achieve the Montreal Protocol back in 1988, it required not only the science of Roland and Molina, it also required actually the advances that were made in the industry to produce new refrigerants that so you could phase out the old refrigerants. So they saw that it was in their comparative advantage to actually have the Montreal Protocol. They thought it was going to be good for their bottom lines. They were the ones that had the new technologies. But also it required to have some very talented professional diplomats in the US State Department, and this was during the Reagan administration, who persisted over a number of years working on getting US support as well as international support for the Montreal Protocol. So often it does require a partnership that's quite broad in order to accomplish these things. In terms of other examples of science diplomacy, of course, the person I worked for, Paul Doty, and earlier Pete Panofsky, they were heavily involved in the 1980s in these track 2 back channel discussions with Soviet scientists on arms control for nuclear weapons. And it turned out when Gorbachev became head in the Soviet Union, the Soviet scientists turned out to be his key science advisors. So all of a sudden there was a great window of opportunity for the scientific dialogue, the track 2, the non-governmental discussions, to have an influence on government policy. And it certainly helped achieve some of the breakthroughs in arms control that occurred in the decade that followed that. With the Iran nuclear agreement, I mentioned that both the Iranian and the US government encouraged this collaboration. There were 3 or 4 workshops a year between the Iranian scientific national academies and the US as the sponsor and the Iranian Academy in Iran. When actually it became possible to have the dialogue on the nuclear issues, we were told that the fact that there was this scientific dialogue for almost 2 decades before helped lay the groundwork for the countries embarking on that. And then one of the greatest successes of science diplomacy, in my view, came from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is actually a very interesting partnership of science and policy. Of course, the scientists produce these reports, but at the end there is this report on recommendations for policymakers, and that's a jointly authored report. It's actually a negotiated document between the policymakers representing governments and the science community. And I think the IPCC has helped build the support both within governments and also within the public for what became the Paris Climate Accords. Then you look now with all of those things that I mentioned, you can see that obviously politics can be a more powerful force than science. Certainly in the short run, we've moved back on all 3 of those. The U.S. withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement, the Iran nuclear accord. Now the U.S. and the Soviets or the Russians are backing out of some of the arms control agreements. Now at risk is START 2. So all of those things are, I think, quite unfortunate and moving in the wrong direction. However, I'm right now talking about science diplomacy pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, but I'm still quite optimistic. In November of 2019, I was asked to give a keynote at the World Science Forum in Budapest on 20 years of science diplomacy. And it was some sense you would call that an optimistic and upbeat talk, even with the political reversals that had occurred. And at the end, I sort of listed the 5 big issues, which I thought were going to be the highest priorities for science diplomacy, for the science community, as well as policymakers to face looking forward. And among the 5 I picked out, I didn't include a pandemic at all. So it shows you it's not so easy predicting the future. I thought actually that the World Health Community really had all this pretty much, they had been communicating and collaborating for decades. They had dealt with, SARS and MERS, go back to Ebola, swine flu, and certainly in the US, the experts that I knew and worked with, they were well prepared in knowledge and plans. There had been plans put on the shelf to deal with a pandemic that could sweep the globe. But when I was in the State Department, I also interacted a fair amount with the intelligence communities. And one of the things they were very interested in was they realized that science and technology, the innovations were producing incredibly fast. And they created great opportunities for the world, but they also created big challenges and threats. And of course, the intelligence communities are obviously worried about those kinds of things. And there's a report written by the intelligence communities, an unclassified report that comes out every 4 years. It's produced right after it's released right after the US presidential election, and it's used to brief the incoming president. It's called the Global Trends Series. So they're producing a new report right now. I don't know how it's going. I suspect they probably have two versions depending on what happens in the election in a couple of weeks. But in the report, Global Trends 2030, which came out in 2012, it's a very interesting discussion of future scenarios. What are some of the game changers, one of the developments that could affect foreign policy and countries, what could be disruptive? And among all the things they listed, they also gave a few what they call black swans, events where there's very low probability, but if they did occur, they could be very disruptive to societies in the world. And among those few that they listed, there were two of them. One was a severe pandemic that circled the globe, and the other was the US backing out of global agreements, withdrawal by the US. So it turns out 2020 actually had these two confounding black swans that interacted with each other and made things worse and more cataclysmic than it might have been otherwise. So we certainly can't ignore these black swans. When I was in the State Department in the good times, 2011 to 2014, I might say, when things were very optimistic, I interacted with lots of countries, with their scientists, with their policymakers and government, and talking about science and technology. And one of the most remarkable things was to me was that every country that I dealt with, whether it was a developed country or a poor country, whether it liked the US government or it didn't like the US government, one was what they wanted advice on was they felt they all had to build further their capacity in science, technology, and innovation. So they thought that was essential for national interests, for the security, the prosperity, for the competitiveness of the country. So whether it was a middle-income country, whether it was an advanced country, or even some of the poorest countries around the world, there was a lot of focus by government leaders on exactly how did they keep up with this very fast-moving science and technology enterprise, where they saw all of a sudden new companies sprout from nothing and be some of the largest companies in the world, a few short years later. So when I talked to these places, when they were looking for advice, I often emphasized what I would say the sort of the mechanics of science, but they were also interested in science advice. How could they get better science advice into their government, building up the capability of their own science community, as well as get it from the outside. So the science advisory ecosystem is also a popular topic in these conversations. And I emphasize kind of the mechanics of, having, of course, good institutions outside of government, inside of government, where you had science advisors in all of them, where you had programs like the AAAS program that gave experience to young science engineering professionals to see what it's like actually working inside the government. So a whole list of things that we could say are the mechanics. And I thought the US had all of these aspects. I thought the US had the most advanced, active and vibrant sort of science policy interface, science advisory ecosystem anywhere in the world. So when the pandemic occurred and the United States response was so catastrophic, I was astounded. I didn't believe that we could perform that badly. And it wasn't just at the political level, the leadership failures that occurred there. There are also failures among science institutions with CDC and testing. For example, and then the failures in our society, the fact that, it's become a political statement, whether you wear a mask or not, and the great divisions that have occurred in American society. A great strength, I think, of American culture, you might call it, has been its individual initiative. And I think that's been very good for our innovation ecosystem, but it's not been very good for societal cohesion. We're trying to reach a consensus when you're confronted with a crisis like this pandemic. So anyway, in thinking again about why did the US fail, and it included some other major developed countries, the UK, I think, did poorly as well. But other countries, take the New Zealands, Iceland, Finland, even Rwanda, South Korea, Taiwan, and other countries did remarkably well. Of course, some of them had experience with the first SARS, with MERS, but it wasn't just from prior experience. It also had aspects related to their culture, to their leadership, to their values. So it just reminded me of one thing that's obvious to all of us, that science can be a very important factor in decisions, but they can be overwhelmed by these other factors of culture, history, leadership, values, ethics, trust, all of those intangible things. And so we disregard them at our peril. One of the most interesting studies that during my tenure at the Academy, well, there were a number of interesting studies, but one that I particularly liked was also requested by the U.S. intelligence communities in 2005, when the report came out. It was looking at science policies of 6 countries. And what the intelligence agencies asked was these 6 countries, and you could guess what they included China and Brazil and Russia and a few others. All of them had very ambitious plans for building up their science and technology. What were the factors that might enable the intelligence community to pick which of those might be most successful in accomplishing their very ambitious goals? So it was a very good committee. It had all kinds of expertise. They looked at all kinds of quantitative data, investments, patents, you name it. And in the end, they concluded something that surprised all of them. If you picked out one factor that probably had more influence than everything else, it related to the culture of the country. Every country has aspects of its culture which can advance innovation, and aspects can retard it. And it's those countries that actually take the very difficult task of moving back some of the hard edges that are retard to innovation, whether it's bureaucracy, corruption, you name it. Those are the ones that are likely to be most successful. So culture is a big factor. Leadership, we've obviously seen that leadership is a very important factor as well, whether or not there's trust in institutions, societal cohesion, all of those things are factors in whether things work out well. So what do we do about this now that we're in this pandemic, particularly for the science community, as we look forward for the political community, and also thinking about what happens after the pandemic is over? One of the, I think that the very bright things about the pandemic, obviously, is the way the science community worldwide has collaborated. I mean, there's still collaboration going between US and Chinese scientists on these issues in every country. So, in fact, the world is actually counting on the science community to pull the rabbit out of the hat with vaccines, that's the way they feel they're going to, defeat the virus. So I think the standing of science has actually grown from this searing experience that we suffered from. And the science community is not about to go back on against collaborating, even though some countries are going to put hurdles, make it more difficult in the way. And one of the biggest issues the U.S. Science Committee faces right now, of course, is the collaboration between the U.S. and China in basic fundamental scientific research. To what extent is that going to create new problematic hurdles? Of course, there are very significant security issues that have to be taken into account as well. So anyway, so I began thinking about, okay, what do we do about all this? What are messages for the science community? What are things we can do in interacting with the policy community? With the science community, I thought, well, one of the first things we have to reemphasize, I think we all know well, is basically the science community really has the obligation, to speak the truth. And when there's miscommunication, mischief occurring by pronouncements from government, the science community has to stand up and say so. I think it's quite remarkable right now. I don't know if you've just seen it in the last day or two, but the New England Journal of Medicine have come out with a strong statement. Lancet in the UK has done the same sort of thing. Scientific American. So yeah, there's much more forward-leaning in the terms of science institutions and speaking out right now in the U.S. as well as in other countries. And so I think that's a good thing. But I also think the scientific community also has to build a more trusting relationship with the general public. Can't just rely on that by faith. And that means really understanding better what the real issues are that people care about. And how can the science community address some of these challenges? We've certainly seen with the impact of the pandemic on inequalities in societies, as well as inequalities between countries. some more research related to how do we address some of these issues in our own country as well as elsewhere, I think is very important. And then with the rapid advance of science and technology, as we said, that these new technologies create great opportunities for humankind, but they also create these threats and challenges. When I was in the State Department dealing with the intelligence community, trying to anticipate what were going to be some of the issues associated with new technologies, the one thing that was totally underestimated in my view by all was the impact on social media, the fact that it could become this tool for societal disruption to the extent that it has come. I don't think that was anticipated at all, to the extent that that has been misused, you might say. But now with synthetic biology, artificial intelligence, robotics, big data, blockchain, all these things have whether positive and negative challenges associated with them. And so it's the responsibility of the science community to be able to alert the world to the challenges that are coming and how to deal with them, and also looking for the black swans that might occur that can be so catastrophic. And then the importance of international scientific collaboration. Now with a number of countries sort of retreating back in their own shell, I think we all recognize that if we're going to meet some of the global challenges, whether it's climate change, whether it's protecting the oceans, the biosphere, et cetera, it's really going to require, it's in all of our national interests for countries to come together and deal with them. And it has to, again, be that partnership between science, policy, and society if we're going to be able to make a difference. So I'm involved with a number of efforts that are looking at how do we do that. The one that I particularly like is it's a series of reports called The World in 2050. It's led by the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Vienna, but it involves a number of scientists from many places around the world. And they've sort of looked at what they call 6 big transformations that they believe are required to put the world on a more sustainable path. I talked to a lot of foreign ministries and people who are science counselors. If you ask them right now, what is the highest priority for science diplomacy? Again, the answer is universal. It's vaccine diplomacy. That's the issue that everyone cares about. One of the countries I'm involved in right now is with Chile, which is a middle-income country. The U.S. Embassy in Santiago created with the Chileans a U.S.-Chile Council on Science, Technology, Innovation. They wanted to explore science diplomacy, and they asked me and another person from the National Science Foundation to begin giving talks and help them with creating these virtual seminars for people that come from the government, come from the academic community, and come from the private sector in Chile. And what we found out was what they really want, what they really care about right now anyway, is how do they build up the capacity in the country dealing with COVID-19 in terms of acquiring access to vaccines, being able to perhaps participate in some of the clinical trials that are going on. So they're not totally dependent. They have Chinese companies all over them right now with the offers of using the vaccines that have been developed in China. And they're probably just one example of what many developing countries around the world are facing right now. So I think there is a lot of work that all of us can do. So I'll tell you what, again, you have to be pretty humble in trying to predict the future. What do I expect, after? I think we will actually defeat the virus because of science primarily. We will still have the problem that sometimes our political systems and our cultures do not adapt very quickly to these challenges. It's certainly going to be more challenging dealing with climate change, for sure. So I personally think, well, of course, a lot depends on, I had to talk to the OECD a week ago about they're trying to predict the future, and they wanted my and a number of other people's perspectives. And I said, well, the first thing you got to look at is what happens in the US election. It's certainly going to be a change, whichever way it goes. If it turns out like the polls say right now, I think you can't go back to before 2016, but I think there will be an effort to try to restore alliances and dealing with some of the misbehavior of China and Russia, more of alliance between the US and its allies in Europe and Japan and Australia and others. There will be a bigger effort trying to deal with some of the global challenges. There will still be conflicts that occur. The biggest black swan that any of us have to worry about, of course, is having a real war again. I think that is, the probability is quite low, but that's probably the most, we know what happened in the 20th century with that. So we still have to worry about all these new weapons that are autonomous weapons, weapons that are incredibly fast, almost no time to react, cyber weapons. So all of those things cannot be neglected as well. So I think there are many challenges for science diplomacy going forward. But I still have a semi-optimistic view that I think that science may not be the final answer in the short run, but I think in the long run, if we're persistent, it can have an important impact. So I think there's a lot science diplomacy can do. I've talked longer than I intended, so maybe I should stop here. I'd be happy to hear what you have to think on any of these issues, as well as your advice on how we get out of the mess that we happen to be in right now.
Thanks, Bill. And yes, we have a lot of questions here, and so I will ask the first one for somebody who had to leave early, but then somebody else also had that same question, and that's sort of on the career front. So, if you're somebody who's changing, mid-career and you want to go into a new field, a new industry, how do you find a mentor? So if somebody like right here on this call, for example, was wanting to go into, science and technology diplomacy, how would they find a mentor?
Well, I think the first thing, you have to take a few risks and to reach out, see if you know somebody that you think would be helpful in that regard, to try them out and approach them and see. You might be surprised. So that's certainly one. Other is to look and see who are the models of the people that you would like to not necessarily follow exactly in the same track, but at least you think illustrate the kind of things that you're looking for, and to reach out to them. So again, my main advice would be to take a few chances and to see if you can make connections that can be helpful to you.
I used to tell people that it took me 5 phone calls to get an answer. Of course, these days, phone calls, but to get an answer. One time I did this when I was at the academy, I got up to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they answered the question. So sometimes, you do have to just kind of start calling people and, see what happens. So I think you're right about it, sort of taking a chance. Okay, so our next question is from Alex Temple, and if everybody could kind of keep your questions short, so Bill has plenty of time to answer. So go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, thank you very much for speaking with all of us tonight. Really appreciate it. I work at State Department in the Office of Science Technology Cooperation, so right by STAS. And I'm wondering, how do you prioritize the long-term and short-term goals, along with how do you prioritize countries? I mean, there's so much out there, big science, and there's a limited capability of what we can do as a government. So what's your method for how to prioritize all that?
I might mention one thing that I found interesting in some of the countries I deal with. They're often sort of middle income countries, but not all. Their foreign ministries are developing, you might say, their strategic roadmap or plan for science diplomacy, but includes countries like India, Colombia, Switzerland. So it's actually a mystery. So some countries actually do it in a more systematic way. I don't think that's going to happen in the State Department. So I don't envision that so there you have to look for your opportunities. And I really enjoyed. I learned a lot from being in the experience in the State Department. I was a real novice, learning what the only bureaucracy over 200 plus years. But the professionals in the State Department, I think, are truly impressive. You need real diplomats at times, for sure. And so I found that you could have discussions with some of them about these longer range issues, and to talk about, okay, what is the strategy by which we're going to try to accomplish? I know there's so much pressure for the short term things that it kind of swamps out, particularly when things have to go up through the chain of command, reaching up to the top. but I found if you find the right person to talk to, sometimes they're the old experienced hands that have been around for a long time, who do have the ability to think long term. It's interesting to have conversations with them and to sort of scope out what might be a strategy that you can take step by step that could actually lead to larger things. But anyway, but the State Department is a very interesting place. I hope it's certainly all the colleagues in STC. We worked together very well, and there were some real superb people, and I'm sure there still are.
Thank you. The next question is from Veronica.
Thank you very much for sharing your perspective.
You're going to have to talk louder, Veronica.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now? Is that okay?
Yes.
I was wondering about the concept of black swans. So you mentioned that some of the things that is very unlikely, and hopefully doesn't happen, is another war. But is there anything else we should be on the lookout for? Besides the pandemic and pulling out of agreements and a war?
Yeah, there probably are some, it's like not really understand, although it wasn't a black swan, not really understanding the impact of social media and how it might be used. So some things might be kind of obvious, but you're just not wise enough to figure it out in advance. I would recommend you might like all the global trends reports are all on the web and for free, but look at the last two in particular, Global Trends 2030, and they changed the name slightly for the one that followed after that in 2016. I think Donald Trump didn't want to be briefed on that one, and I have no idea what's in the one but I'm going to certainly look at it. But there's some really very capable people in the intelligence community who think long and hard about these issues. There was also very interesting, I wrote one of my editorial and science diplomas on Foreign Affairs. They had a very interesting article maybe 2 years ago on future worlds, where they had 5 different people write on what was the dominant trend for the future that was going to impact things, and 5 future worlds. But I found that very stimulating reading, and tried to write about what was the role of science and technology in each of them, and how could science and technology deal with some of the hard aspects of these different future worlds.
Great, thank you. Alessandra?
So speaking of forecasting, the trend right now is to move away from expert-based forecasting to model-based forecasting, which means you are reliant on how good your data sets are. So how does science diplomacy manage trying to get better data sets so it can have more comprehensive forecasting that is more accurate, but also the fact that giving those data sets up means that we may disrupt their technology development? Is there an interplay there?
No, that's a very interesting question. I think we've all recognized that the future is data, and being able to analyze these enormous amounts that are being collected. We see how it's been monetized by companies. There is another organization, intelligence agencies, called IARPA, which is their version of DARPA. And they do a lot of work related to these sorts of things, trying to analyze all the scientific data in the world and try to draw out nuggets and things of that sort. So I'm not a real expert on data issues, but there are a lot of people paying significant attention to it right now. So it's model-based forecasting. So yeah, I think that's something, if I were starting off again, that was something I would try to focus on a lot.
Okay, great, thank you. Evan?
Why do you think certain scientific issues have become so politically divisive, and how do you think us as scientists can help to build trust with science and to help keep it objective?
Yeah, no, that's also an important question, a difficult one these days. I guess in more normal times, I think when I was working at the academies, both Debbie and I, producing reports, some of which the government liked, some of which they didn't like, or didn't like all aspects of it. we recognize that for politicians, obviously, that their political views are kind of hold sway. Sometimes they didn't want to hear what science had to say, or tried to interpret it in ways that would benefit whatever their own political position was. But I didn't find very often, Debbie should comment too, the extent to which, so what is conventional wisdom in the scientific community was almost totally discounted by policymakers. That was really kind of a surprise. And to the extent to which large segments of the public, have fallen into the trap of believing that science is political. Certainly for a long time dealing with climate change, we know because of vested interests related to big industries and others, it's what science has to say has been challenged. But in public health, I've never quite seen it to the extent that it's occurred recently. So what can we do about it? I said in building back up trust with all aspects of the public. I think everybody recognizes now that science is the one thing that is going to save us from the pandemic. So that's good. So you probably have a bigger community out there that are perhaps more receptive to science. But again, the only thing I could really offer was trying to engage more with the public to understand what they're really worried and concerned about. I'll just give you one example of what happened when I was not at the Academy, but I thought it was really very interesting initiative, and that was related to the blowout of the Gulf in the Gulf of Mexico, the Deepwater Horizon accident. The Academy's got a large amount of money from BP that was be used to try to help the communities in the Gulf restore, protect the environment, protect livelihoods, and all of that. And so they had an initiative related to resilience, the resilience of society to be able to withstand these kind of shocks, to deal with them better. And they decided to go out and meet with communities, not only with the community leaders, but also members of the public, to try to understand in these communities how they define resilience for their community. And it was different depending on where they live, whether it was in the forests of the Northwest, or whether it was in the Gulf Coast, or whether it was in the Middle West, in the farmland. But going out and listening to people and their needs and their views, I think it was a learning experience for the scientific community. Instead of lecturing, it was a lot more listening. And I think it sort of helped that effort to realize, one, they needed to do more research on some of those issues and perhaps address some of the issues that they had neglected before. So I think building up trust is a long-term enterprise, but it can certainly be helped by leadership from the top.
Okay, and we have one person who kindly skipped their question, so we could fit one more in before time is up. So Leah, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Bill. I don't know if you remember me. We met back when I worked at the Academy way back when, but you mentioned that folks weren't aware of the social media issue, but I had colleagues at DARPA and at Office of Naval Research who had been studying Boko Haram and ISIS and other terrorist groups, and how they were using social media to not only spread disinformation, but coordinate their activities and do situational awareness. They had made many attempts to get the attention of leadership at OSTP and other high-level officials within the administration, but were not having much success. And finally, in 2014, I was able to connect them with Ed Felton and Afua, and so for that's the Chief Technologies Office at OSTP. And but so what strategies, if you were encountered that kind of roadblock, what strategies would you use to get policymakers' attention on issues that you think were very important, but was not seeming to get much traction?
That was interesting. So this was sort of 2013, 2014 was.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, no, that I wasn't aware of it myself. With the, I'll tell you, with the right leadership, and what I mean by the right leadership, my successor as the Science and Technology Advisor, Secretary of State Vaughn Tarikian, he developed a very good relationship with the Deputy Secretary at the time, and this was when I guess Kerry was Secretary. And now that Deputy Secretary is the Chief Foreign Policy Advisor to Biden, so he may be in for a big job, depending on the election. But he said he wanted Vaughn to arrange for him briefings on some of the new technologies and the implications, trying to think about the future. And so that Vaughn put together several seminars with him on some of these technologies. So you had someone in a leadership position who saw that these changes and impacts from science and technology were going to be very influential and impactful, and willing to listen. That's not always the case. He may be an unusual person. His name is Tony Blinken, was the name of the person. He'd probably be the national security advisor if Biden gets elected. But anyway, with the right kind of leadership, you may have people somewhere in the chain that are willing to listen. But then, as we all know, working in bureaucracies, trying to find, particularly if you have to go around your bosses to get to get them, it can be challenging. But we see how, of course, in the case of the pandemic, but we got burned by not thinking with foresight, and especially when we had all these plans prepared that were sitting there waiting to be used. So, but nice to see you again, Leah. I remember now.
Okay, so we're out of time, but I'm going to ask you one question, last question, Bill, which is often for the students, when I'm teaching, I say, you need to give a 1-minute policy pitch. Okay, so now the new President-elect Biden has called you and said, okay, what is the most important thing that I should do related to science and diplomacy? What would you tell him? Of
course, I've got a vested interest. I would tell him that.
That's okay. It's okay to have a vested interest, right?
You need to appoint a really good person as the science and technology advisor to the Secretary of State, who can actually can facilitate the connecting you and the Secretary with whatever scientists have the right expertise to deal with the issues at hand. So that may be a small step, but I think it can be a useful one. Anyway, I'll just say one last thing. When in one of these conferences before, where we asked the people at the end, I learned this from somebody else. Okay, for panelists, okay, now you have to send out a tweet. Okay, so your final summation is a tweet. What would that tweet be? That really got everyone to focus very quickly on what was the essence of what they were trying to communicate.
Okay, well, that's good. I hear that. Everybody who's my student, that's the next thing. You got to get it down to a tweet. However many character tweets are these days. Okay, well, thank you very much, Bill. So if everybody could open their mics and just give a round of applause to Bill, that would be great.
Hi, Catherine. I can see Catherine.
Great.
Thank you all. It's been.
Go ahead, Bill.
No, it's just been fun talking with you. I wish I had talked less so I could listen more to all of you.
Oh, well, yeah, that's there's never enough time to do everything. So yeah, thank you all very much for participating. We will post this recording, up on our website so that those who couldn't make it can also benefit from Bill's words of wisdom. And like I said, I really appreciate everybody participating in our very first event. Thank you very much and have a good evening.